These are 10 rulers whose policies and wars cost tens of millions of lives, yet nearly all of them died in disgrace, defeat, or obscurity. From Stalin's lonely death on a dacha floor, while terrified guards waited 13 hours to call a doctor, to Idi Amin's quiet end in a Saudi hospital bed, history's most murderous leaders demonstrate a consistent pattern. Absolute power eventually consumes itself. Let's start with the man who ruled the largest country on earth and killed more of his own citizens than any foreign army ever could. Joseph Stalin was born, Ioseb Zhugashvili, on December 18, 1878, in Gori, Georgia. Scarred by smallpox, his left arm withered from a childhood accident, standing only 5 feet 4 inches tall, Stalin carried physical insecurities that would drive a hunger for absolute control over hundreds of millions. His path to power began in an Orthodox seminary, where he discovered Karl Marx. Expelled in 1899, he spent 2 decades as a revolutionary, robbing banks, organizing strikes, enduring Siberian exile. He adopted the name Stalin, Man of Steel, to replace the Georgian surname that marked him as an outsider. When Vladimir Lenin died on January 21, 1924, Stalin wasn't the obvious successor. Leon Trotsky was the brilliant orator, the charismatic leader of the Red Army. But Stalin held a position that seemed bureaucratic and boring. General Secretary of the Communist Party. What his rivals didn't understand was that this role controlled every party appointment across the Soviet Union. While Trotsky gave speeches, Stalin placed his allies in positions of power. By 1929, Stalin had won. Trotsky was expelled from the Soviet Union and would be assassinated with an ice axe in Mexico in 1940. Grigory Zinoviev and Lev Kamenev were executed in August 1936 after show trials where they confessed to crimes they never committed. Nikolai Bukharin, the last major rival, was shot in March 1938. Stalin's method was consistent. Form temporary alliances, destroy your enemies, then turn on your former allies. What followed was a reign of terror that scholars still struggle to quantify. Between 1932 and 1933, a famine swept through Ukraine that historians now call the Holodomor. Estimates range from 3.5 million to 7 million deaths in some of the most heavily affected regions. The Soviet state confiscated grain while people starved in the streets. Exports continued to pay Soviet debts abroad while Ukrainians died with distended bellies. Guards shot anyone caught, gleaning leftover kernels from collective farm fields. Stalin didn't just kill individuals, he targeted entire ethnic groups for deportation. On February 23, 1944, the Soviet secret police launched Operation Lentil, deporting 496,000 Chechens and Ingush from their homeland to Central Asia. Estimates of deaths range from tens of thousands to far higher, with Chechen sources claiming up to 400,000. The Crimean Tatars, deported in May 1944, lost between 40 and 46% of their population within 3 years. The Moscow show trials of 1936 to 1938 represent some of the most surreal moments in Stalin's terror. The entire old Bolshevik leadership appeared in public courtrooms and confessed to absurd conspiracies. They admitted to assassinating Lenin, who had died of natural causes, They confessed to simultaneously spying for Germany and Japan, nations that were rivals. They claimed to have poisoned wells and plotted to dismember the Soviet Union. These confessions came after months of torture and threats against their families. In April and May of 1940, Soviet secret police executed 21,768 Polish officers, intellectuals, and officials in what became known as the Katyn massacre. They shot each victim in the back of the head. One executioner, Vasily Blokhin, personally killed between 10,000 and 15,000 people, making him often described as one of the most prolific executioners in recorded history. Stalin lived in a state of permanent paranoia. He trusted no one, not even his own family. His second wife, Nadezhda Alliluyeva, shot herself in November 1932 after a public argument with Stalin at a dinner party. Their daughter, Svetlana, would later write that her father was a very simple man, very rude, very cruel. Stalin's eldest son, Yakov, was captured by the Germans in 1941. When the Nazis offered to exchange him for a captured German officer, Stalin refused, saying he would not trade a marshal for a lieutenant. Yakov died in Sachsenhausen concentration camp, reportedly by running into an electrified fence. By 1945, Stalin ruled 22.4 million square kilometers and approximately 180 million Soviet citizens, with an additional 100 million people under Soviet influence in Eastern Europe. He personally reviewed arrest lists containing hundreds of thousands of names and wrote death penalty beside those he condemned. Every Soviet citizen lived in fear that a knock on the door at 3 a.m. meant arrest, torture, and execution, or a one-way trip to Siberia. The most conservative estimates, based on declassified Soviet archives, document 799,455 executions between 1921 and 1953. 681,692 of those occurred during just the Great Purge of 1937 to 1938. These weren't abstract numbers. They meant families waking to pre-dawn knocks on the door, husbands vanishing into black cars, children learning not to ask where their parents went. The Gulag system processed 18 million people between 1930 and 1953. At least 1.5 to 1 7/10 million died in the camps. Some scholars argue higher, but estimates vary widely. Yet all this power, all this terror, all this control couldn't save Stalin from the dysfunction of the system he created. On March 1st, 1953, Stalin attended an all-night dinner party with his inner circle, as was his custom. He dismissed his guards around 6:30 in the morning. Hours passed. Stalin didn't emerge from his room. His guards stood outside his door, terrified. Entering the room uninvited could mean death. Not entering could also mean death. They waited until 10 or 11 o'clock that evening, over 13 hours after he should have awoken, before finally opening the door. They found Stalin lying on the floor in a puddle of his own urine, unable to move or speak. His watch had stopped at 6:30. They called security officials, not doctors. The most powerful man in the world lay paralyzed on the floor while his guards debated protocol. Medical care finally arrived more than 13 hours after his collapse. Stalin died on March 5th, 1953, at 9:50 in the evening. Lavrenti Beria, his secret police chief, and one of the most feared men in the Soviet Union, reportedly bragged afterward, "I did him in. I saved all of you." Whether Stalin was murdered, allowed to die, or simply the victim of his own paranoid system that made his guards too afraid to help him, remains uncertain. What's clear is that the man who had ordered millions of deaths spent his final hours surrounded by people too terrified to call a doctor. The aftermath came swiftly. By December 1953, Beria himself was arrested and executed, shot in the head, just as he had ordered for so many others. In February 1956, Nikita Khrushchev delivered what became known as the secret speech to the 20th Party Congress, denouncing Stalin's crimes in such graphic detail that members of the audience reportedly suffered heart attacks during the reading. Stalin's body was removed from Lenin's mausoleum in October 1961 and buried in a simple grave behind the mausoleum wall. His daughter Svetlana defected to the United States in 1967. The man who imprisoned his own doctors during the doctor's plot he fabricated died partly because medical care was delayed. The dictator who refused to negotiate for his captured son died leaving a grandson raised in obscurity in the West. The man of steel ended up removed from his own mausoleum, his name stripped from cities across the Soviet Union, his crimes documented and denounced by the very system he created. Stalin controlled an empire but died alone on a floor, and everything he built was dismantled by his successors. If Stalin killed the most people in his own country, the next ruler on our list killed more people than anyone else in human history. Mao Zedong was born on December 26, 1893, in Shaoshan village, Hunan province. He came to power through decades of guerrilla warfare, surviving a catastrophic military retreat that somehow became his revolutionary origin myth. The Long March from October 1934 to October 1935 covered 6,000 miles of China's harshest terrain. Tens of thousands of communist soldiers began the march. Only a fraction finished. On October 1st, 1949, Mao stood at Tiananmen Gate and proclaimed the People's Republic of China. He immediately began the land reform campaign, which he later claimed killed 700,000 landlords between 1950 and 1952. That was just the beginning. Between 1958 and 1962, Mao launched the Great Leap Forward, an attempt to rapidly industrialize China through sheer willpower and revolutionary enthusiasm. He ordered peasants to abandon farming and build backyard steel furnaces, producing useless pig iron while crops rotted in the fields. The Four Pests campaign sought to exterminate sparrows to protect grain, but killing the sparrows triggered locust plagues that devastated what crops remained. Local officials, terrified to report failure to Mao, inflated their production figures. The central government then confiscated grain based on these false reports, taking food that didn't exist. Research in provincial archives suggests estimates ranging roughly from 15 to 45 million deaths, with historian Frank Dikötter proposing the higher figure. Some scholars argue lower, but what's undisputed is this was one of the deadliest mass killings in human history. China's total population actually declined in both 1960 and 1961, only the third time this had occurred in 600 years of records. In Anhui province, the death toll reached 18% of the population. Multiple provincial Archives contain reports of cannibalism. When officials tried to report the famine to Mao, he dismissed their concerns. Mao downplayed famine reports and pushed grain quotas anyway, even as the death toll mounted into the millions. Provincial archives document his callous indifference to mass starvation. Yet even as millions starved, Mao lived in luxury. His personal physician, Li Jisui, documented life inside Mao's compound. Mao maintained dozens of mansions across China, many built to be atomic bomb-proof, equipped with heated swimming pools. According to Li's memoir, which some historians contest, Mao maintained relationships with multiple young women simultaneously during the Cultural Revolution, even as he preached revolutionary purity to the masses. The Cultural Revolution, launched in 1966, mobilized young Red Guards to attack the Four Olds: old customs, old culture, old habits, and old ideas. In practice, this meant destroying anything connected to China's past and attacking anyone in authority. Teachers were beaten to death by their students. Parents were denounced by their children. Intellectuals were forced to confess crimes in struggle sessions before hostile mobs. Suicide became epidemic. The Red August of 1966 saw at least 1,772 people killed in Beijing alone, with 33,695 homes ransacked and 85,196 families forced to flee the capital. In Tibet, nearly all of the region's 6,000 monasteries were destroyed, leaving only 8 intact. Stanford researcher Andrew Walder's analysis estimates between 1.1 and 1.6 million violent deaths during the Cultural Revolution, with 75% caused by state repression rather than factional fighting among rebels. The Little Red Book, officially titled Quotations from Chairman Mao, became the second most printed book in human history after the Bible. Between 1966 and 1971, over 1 billion copies were distributed. Every Chinese citizen was expected to carry and study it daily. Mao's health began failing in 1972. He suffered multiple heart attacks throughout 1976. On September 2nd, 1976, a severe heart attack left him comatose. He died on September 9th, 1976, at 10 minutes past midnight, after life support was disconnected. Within 1 month, on October 6th, 1976, the Gang of Four was arrested. This group included Mao's wife, Jiang Qing, who had been one of the Cultural Revolution's primary enforcers. At her trial, Jiang offered what may be history's most damning defense. "I was Chairman Mao's dog. Whomever he asked me to bite, I bit." She received a death sentence that was commuted to life imprisonment. She committed suicide in her cell in May 1991. Deng Xiaoping, who succeeded Mao, created an official assessment. Mao was 70% right, 30% wrong. Chen Yun, another party elder, offered a more nuanced epitaph. Had Mao died in 1956, his achievements would have been immortal. Had he died in 1966, he would still have been a great man but flawed. But he died in 1976. Alas, what can one say? The supreme irony is that Mao's portrait still hangs over Tiananmen Square, and his embalmed body lies in a mausoleum where millions pay respects annually. The man who caused more deaths than Hitler and Stalin combined is still honored as the founder of modern China. But if Mao killed the most people in total, then Pol Pot killed the highest percentage of his own population. Pol Pot was born Saloth Sar, likely on May 19, 1925, though French colonial records suggest 1928. He came from a prosperous farming family with connections to the royal court, yet failed academically at every level. He would die quietly in the jungle, cremated on a pile of tires with only 12 people watching, no trial, no justice, no accountability. Paris radicalized him in ways his studies didn't. He joined the French Communist Party and became part of the Cercle Marxiste, a group of Cambodian students who would later form the Khmer Rouge leadership. He returned to Cambodia in January 1953 and spent the next 2 decades building guerrilla forces in the countryside. American bombing between 1969 and 1973 dropped 2.7 million tons of ordnance on Cambodia, more than all Allied forces dropped in World War II. This bombing destabilized the country and drove recruitment to the Khmer Rouge. On April 17, 1975, Khmer Rouge forces entered Phnom Penh, the capital. Within hours, they began evacuating the entire city. 2.5 million residents were ordered into the countryside. Hospital patients were wheeled out in their beds. Mothers who had just given birth were forced to walk. The journey killed between 2,000 and 3,000 people as the first days alone. The Khmer Rouge declared this year 0, the beginning of a new civilization. They abolished money and dynamited the national currency. They banned religion, making Buddhism, Christianity, and Islam illegal. They closed all schools and universities. They separated families into age-segregated labor brigades. Parents didn't raise their children. Husbands and wives didn't live together. Everyone worked in agricultural communes under the slogan, "To keep you is no gain, to lose you is no loss." Anyone with education became a target. Teachers, doctors, lawyers, and engineers were executed. Wearing glasses could mean death because it suggested literacy. Speaking a foreign language was often fatal. Knowing someone who had fled the country made you suspect. Tuol Sleng, a former high school, converted into an interrogation center known as S21, processed between 14,000 and 20,000 prisoners. Guards photographed every prisoner upon arrival, creating an archive of faces that still haunts visitors today. Prisoners were tortured until they confessed to working for the CIA, the KGB, or Vietnamese intelligence. The confessions meant nothing because everyone confessed eventually. After confession came execution. Only 12 people are known to have survived S21. 7 adults who had useful skills like machinery repair or painting, and 5 children. The killing fields at Chuang Ek, just outside Phnom Penh, became the execution site for S21 prisoners. Guards bashed prisoners' heads against trees to save bullets. Tetut. Testimony and museum accounts describe the Chankiri tree as used for killing infants and young children, with the reason given to prevent them from growing up and taking revenge for their parents' deaths. The Documentation Center of Cambodia has mapped 23,745 mass graves containing approximately 1.3 million bodies. Additional hundreds of thousands died from starvation, disease, and exhaustion. In less than 4 years, the Khmer Rouge killed between 1.5 and 2.2 million people, approximately 21 to 25% of Cambodia's population. 1 in every 4 Cambodians died. By 1977, the Khmer Rouge had become so paranoid that they started executing their own cadres. 4/5 of the prisoners at S-21 were former Khmer Rouge members, accused of being Vietnamese spies or CIA agents. The revolution was consuming itself. In April 1978, Khmer Rouge forces attacked Vietnamese border villages, killing over 3,000 civilians at Ba Chuk alone. Vietnam invaded in December 1978. On January 7, 1979, Vietnamese forces entered Phnom Penh and found it virtually empty, littered with decomposing bodies. Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge leadership fled to jungle bases along the Thai border. The international response was shameful. The Khmer Rouge retained Cambodia's United Nations seat until 1982. China provided an estimated $1 billion or more in aid, representing 90% of Khmer Rouge foreign support. The United States avoided calling the atrocities genocide until 1989. In practice, this meant the architects of mass murder continued receiving international recognition while survivors suffered. Pol Pot lived comfortably in the jungle for nearly 2 decades, protected by Chinese support and Thai tolerance. In June 1997, facing internal revolt after he ordered the murder of his former deputy, his own movement subjected him to a show trial and placed him under house arrest. He died on April 15, 1998, Khmer New Year. The official cause was heart failure, but no autopsy was performed despite requests from the United States and Cambodian government. Reports suggest he may have committed suicide with Valium and chloroquine upon learning of his impending extradition to face trial. 3 days after his death, Pol Pot's body was cremated on a pile of old tires and rubbish with only about 12 people present. No speeches, no eulogies. Today, the cremation site sits 100 meters from a multi-story casino. Some former Khmer Rouge members in the area still say he wasn't such a bad guy. Pol Pot never faced justice. Near the end of his life, he told interviewers, "My conscience is clear. The man who killed 1 in 4 Cambodians died peacefully in the jungle and was burned like garbage, never having to answer for his crimes. Pol Pot's regime eventually fell. The next ruler created a system that continues to this day." Kim Il-sung was born on April 15, 1912, as Kim Song-ju near Pyongyang. Soviet forces installed him as North Korea's leader in 1945, after he spent decades leading anti-Japanese guerrilla operations in Manchuria. He would create the only hereditary communist dynasty in history, one that continues oppressing North Koreans to this day, 3 generations later. On September 9, 1948, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea was formally established with Kim as its leader. He immediately began building a cult of personality that would eventually exceed anything seen in Stalin's Soviet Union or Mao's China. By 1961, an East German embassy report noted that there was no room, no classroom, no public building in North Korea where a photo of Kim Il-sung could not be found. Every household was required to display his portrait, and damage to that portrait meant imprisonment. Kim initiated the Korean War on June 25, 1950. Archival evidence confirms it was his idea, not Stalin's, though he required Soviet and Chinese backing. the war killed approximately 2.5 to 3 million people, including 1.5 million civilians. North Korean forces committed systematic massacres during their occupation of South Korea, executing government officials, police, and anyone suspected of opposing communism. After the war, Kim established the Kwanliso system of political prison camps. These camps continue operating today, holding an estimated 80,000 to 130,000 political prisoners. Outside researchers estimate that a significant percentage of inmates die from malnutrition. The system imprisons entire families for up to 3 generations under guilt by association rules. If you commit a political crime, your parents, your children, and your grandchildren all go to the camps. Kim lived in 8 or more palaces with full staffs, while his population faced chronic shortages. He enjoyed private stables, golf courses, and what witnesses described as Disneyland-like amusement parks. The Songbun system he created divided the entire population into a caste structure that determined food rations, housing, education opportunities, and life prospects. Your family's political history determined everything about your life. In 1989, Kim converted Camp Number 11, a functioning prison camp, into a personal villa. Kim suffered a heart attack on July 7, 1994, and died early the following morning at age 82. His son, Kim Jong-il, assumed power, completing the first hereditary succession in any communist state. But Kim Il-sung's story didn't end with his death. A 1998 constitutional amendment declared him eternal president of the Republic, a position he holds to this day. His embalmed body lies in the Kumsusan Palace of the Sun, the world's largest mausoleum for a communist leader, at 115,000 square feet. Converting the palace into a mausoleum cost an estimated $100 million to $900 million during a period when famine was killing hundreds of thousands of North Koreans. The man who preached Juche, or self-reliance, created one of the world's most aid-dependent economies. His dynasty continues under his grandson, Kim Jong-un, but an estimated 60% of the population lives below the poverty line. Kim Il-sung's legacy isn't just mass death, but a perpetual machine of suffering that continues operating 3 decades after he died. Kim's dynasty persists. Next comes a dictator who proved that monsters can also be clowns. Idi Amin was born around 1925 near Koboko in northwestern Uganda. He joined the British King's African Rifles in 1946 as an assistant cook and rose through the ranks, partly due to his imposing size at 6'3" and 300 pounds, and partly due to his willingness to use extreme violence during Britain's suppression of the Mau Mau rebellion in Kenya. On January 25, 1971, while President Milton Obote attended a Commonwealth meeting in Singapore, Amin launched his coup. Troops sealed Entebbe Airport, surrounded the capital Kampala, and blocked major roads. Within days, Amin declared himself president. Western powers initially welcomed the coup. The United States had maintained intelligence contacts with Amin during his military career, and Western reactions to the coup were initially mixed. Within months, Amin began eliminating perceived enemies. By early 1972, approximately 5,000 Acholi and Lango soldiers, ethnic groups associated with Obote, and twice as many civilians had disappeared. 2/3 of Uganda's 9,000-man army appeared to have been executed within the first year of Amin's rule. The State Research Bureau, headquartered in a pink L-shaped building on Nakasero Hill in Kampala, became Amin's primary torture center. Guards killed up to 20 people daily. Bodies were dumped in the Nile River in such numbers that they clogged the intake pipes at Owen Falls Hydroelectric Dam. Methods included strangling, shooting, beheading, and, according to some accounts, feeding victims to crocodiles. In August 1972, Amin claimed that God appeared to him in a dream commanding that Uganda's Asian population must move. He gave 80,000 British Asians and South Asian citizens 90 days to leave the country, confiscating their property. 5,655 firms, ranches, farms, and estates were seized and distributed to Amin's supporters. The Asian community had contributed 90% of Uganda's tax revenue. Manufacturing output collapsed from 740 million shillings to 254 million shillings by 1979. Amin's regime killed between 100,000 and 500,000 people over 8 years, though exact numbers remain impossible to verify. High-profile victims included Archbishop Janani Luwum, who was arrested on February 16, 1977, and officially died in a car crash. His body was bullet-riddled, shot through the mouth, and at least 3 times in the chest. Uganda now has a public holiday in his honor. Amin's behavior became increasingly bizarre. He proposed marriage to Queen Elizabeth II. He challenged Tanzania's President Julius Nyerere to a boxing match to settle border disputes. After the United Kingdom broke diplomatic relations, Amin made British businessmen carry him in a sedan chair. He wore a kilt to the Saudi royal funeral. He described Adolf Hitler as a great man. When asked about cannibalism, Amin never denied eating human flesh, but commented that it was too salty for his taste. In October 1978, Ugandan forces invaded Tanzania's Kagera region, killing 1,500 civilians. Tanzania counterattacked with 150,000 soldiers. By April 10th and 11th, 1979, Kampala fell with minimal resistance. Amin fled by helicopter, briefly declared the city of Jinja the new capital, then escaped to Libya. After initial refuge in Libya, Amin settled in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, where the royal family granted him asylum on condition he stay out of politics. He lived comfortably for 24 years, seen pushing shopping carts at supermarkets, getting massages at health clubs, and praying at mosques. When his 4th wife asked President Yoweri Museveni to allow Amin to return home to die, Museveni responded, he would have to answer for his sins the moment he was brought back. Amin died on August 16, 2003, of kidney failure at age 78 to 80. No nation attempted to bring him to trial during his 24-year exile. He was buried in Jeddah's Ruwais cemetery within 24 hours following Islamic tradition. The man who called himself His Excellency President for Life, Field Marshal Al-Haji, Dr. Idi Amin Dada, VCDSO MCCBO, Lord of all the beasts of the earth and fishes of the seas, and conqueror of the British Empire in Africa, in general and Uganda in particular, died peacefully in exile and was buried quietly in a foreign land. From Uganda's brutal buffoon to Japan's imperial architect of atrocity, Hideki Tojo was born on December 30th, 1884, in Tokyo to a military family. He earned the nickname the Razor for his sharp decision-making as head of the Kempeitai military police in Manchuria. He became Prime Minister of Japan on October 18, 1941, inheriting negotiations with the United States that his government was unwilling to resolve peacefully. He would try to shoot himself in the heart and miss. American doctors would save him specifically so he could be hanged, and decades later he'd be secretly enshrined as a hero, ensuring Japan's emperors could never visit their most sacred shrine again. By November 2, 1941, Tojo reported failure to find a diplomatic solution. The December 1st Imperial Conference approved war with the United States, Britain, and the Netherlands. When the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor succeeded on December 7th, Tojo called it a blessing from heaven. At the Japanese Empire's maximum extent, from December 1941 to mid-1942, Tojo's government controlled territory from Burma to the Central Pacific, ruling hundreds of millions of people under occupation. He accumulated multiple positions simultaneously: Prime Minister, War Minister, Home Minister, Foreign Minister, Education Minister, Commerce Minister, and by February 1944, Chief of General Staff. The Bataan Death March in April 1942 forced 72,000 to 78,000 prisoners to march 65 miles with minimal food or water. Between 5,000 and 18,000 Filipinos and 500 to 650 Americans died during the march itself. Another 26,000 Filipinos and 1,500 Americans died at Camp O'Donnell shortly after arrival. The Burma-Thailand Railway, built between 1942 and 1943, killed over 12,000 Allied prisoners of war and up to 90,000 Asian forced laborers. Workers died at a rate of approximately 1 death per railroad tie laid along the 258-mile route. The Comfort Women system forced approximately 200,000 women into sexual slavery for Japanese soldiers. Many victims died in captivity. Some were as young as 11 or 12. The system subjected women to repeated sexual violence for years. Many survivors have only recently begun speaking publicly about their experiences, and the Japanese government's acknowledgement of responsibility remains contested. Japan's biological warfare program included Unit 731, which operated under senior military protection and killed approximately 14,000 people in human experiments. Scientists conducted vivisection without anesthesia, tested frostbite by freezing limbs and then thawing them, and deliberately infected prisoners with plague, cholera, and other diseases. Films of these experiments were shown to Tojo, who described them as unpleasant, but allowed them to continue. Unit 731's biological attacks on Chinese villages killed an estimated 200,000 to 500,000 additional civilians. The total death toll attributable to Japanese war crimes during Tojo's leadership ranges from 10 million to 30 million people, the vast majority of them Asian civilians. Yet Tojo's government portrayed the war as liberating Asia from Western colonialism. Military reverses at Midway, Guadalcanal, and Saipan eroded Tojo's support. After Saipan fell in July 1944, despite Tojo's promise that it never would, he resigned on July 18, 1944. when American forces arrived to arrest him on September 11th, 1945. Tojo shot himself in the chest with a pistol. Despite aiming at a charcoal mark drawn on his chest to guide the bullet to his heart, he missed. As blood bubbled from a 6-inch wound, he declared, "The Greater East Asia War was justified and righteous. I assume the responsibility for the war. Banzai!" American doctors saved his life with blood transfusions so he could stand trial. The Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal lasted over 2.5 years from 1946 to 1948. Tojo admitted responsibility for Pearl Harbor, but claimed the war was justified. On November 4th, 1948, the verdict declared 7 defendants guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity, with death sentences for all 7. Tojo was hanged at Sugamo Prison on December 23rd, 1948, 1 week before his 64th birthday. His body was cremated, and according to declassified 2021 documents, his ashes were scattered over the Pacific Ocean, approximately 30 miles east of Yokohama, to prevent his grave from becoming a shrine for militarists. Yet, on October 17th, 1978, Tojo was secretly enshrined at Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo alongside other convicted war criminals. This decision created an impossible situation. Emperor Hirohito refused to visit Yasukuni after the 1978 enshrinement. Neither has any subsequent emperor. The man who died, claiming he acted to protect the emperor from prosecution, became the reason the imperial family stopped visiting Japan's most sacred military shrine. Tojo's crimes served empire. Leopold's served only profit. Leopold II of Belgium was born on April 9th, 1835 in Brussels. He became King of the Belgians on December 17th, 1865, and immediately began seeking a colonial empire to match Belgium's European rivals. He would extract a fortune from a vast territory without ever setting foot there. A slaughterhouse he built, but never witnessed. In 1876, Leopold organized the Brussels Geographic Conference, presenting himself as a philanthropist eager to bring Christianity, Western civilization, and commerce to Africa. The Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885 gave Leopold personal ownership of the Congo, not as a Belgian colony, but as his private property. The territory was 76 times larger than Belgium itself. For several years, the Congo Free State operated at a loss, but John Boyd Dunlop's 1887 invention of inflatable rubber tubes changed everything. Global demand for rubber exploded. Leopold's administrators implemented a system to extract rubber from the Congo as quickly and cheaply as possible. Villages were assigned impossible quotas. The Force Publique, Leopold's private army that grew to 19,000 soldiers by 1896, enforced compliance through hostage-taking, whipping with the shikot, a whip made of hippopotamus hide, and mass killing. The hand-severing system became the Congo Free State's most infamous practice. Officers required soldiers to present severed hands as proof that bullets weren't wasted on hunting. Soldiers began severing hands from living people to meet their quotas. Missionary William Shepherd reported in 1899 that a chief showed him 81 right hands being smoked over a fire, explaining, "I always have to cut off the right hands of those we kill in order to show the state how many we have killed. One photograph from this period shows a man named Nsala staring at the severed hand and foot of his 5-year-old daughter Boale. She had been killed and cannibalized by an ABIR company militia after Nsala failed to meet his rubber quota. His wife was also killed. This image became one of the first uses of atrocity photography for humanitarian campaigning. Revenue from Leopold's private domain rose from 150,000 francs in 1890 to 18 million francs in 1901. Rubber exports increased from 250 tons to 1,200 tons between 1892 and 1896. All this wealth flowed to Leopold personally. The population of the Congo Free State collapsed catastrophically. Millions died. Some estimates suggest up to approximately 10 million between 1885 and 1920. What remains undisputed is that the population collapse was massive, driven by killing, starvation, disease, and a plummeting birth rate from families torn apart by forced labor. Leopold couldn't hide the atrocities forever. In 1890, African-American historian George Washington Williams became the first person to use the phrase crimes against humanity to describe Leopold's administration. British consul Roger Casement's 1904 report documented the enslavement, mutilation, and torture of natives on the rubber plantations. Edmund Dana Morel and Casement founded the Congo Reform Association in 1904, creating what historians consider the first modern international human rights movement. International pressure finally forced Belgium to annex the Congo on November 15, 1908, ending Leopold's personal rule. He received 50 million francs in personal payment, plus 45.5 million francs for his building projects. Before the handover, Leopold ordered the burning of the Congo Free State archives. The fires continued for 8 days. He told an aide, "They have no right to know what I did there." Leopold died on December 17, 1909, of an embolism. His funeral cortege was booed by crowds in Brussels. He had become deeply unpopular, both due to Congo revelations and personal scandals. For decades after Leopold's death, Belgium engaged in what historian Adam Hochschild calls the Great Forgetting. Many Belgians remembered Leopold as the Builder King, whose monuments grace Brussels. Following George Floyd's death in 2020, Black Lives Matter protests led to Leopold statue vandalism and removal across Belgium. In 2020, King Philippe expressed deepest regrets for acts of violence and cruelty, but still has not formally apologized or mentioned Leopold by name. Leopold created an elaborate territory, 76 times the size of Belgium without ever visiting it. He constructed palaces and monuments with blood money while never witnessing the horror that paid for them. And his great-great-grandnephew still rules Belgium today. A living connection to a legacy the nation struggles to acknowledge. From the colonial tyrant who never saw his colony to the ancient conqueror who saw everything he conquered. Genghis Khan was born around 1162 near Burkhan Khaldun Mountain with the name Temujin. His father was poisoned by Tatars when Temujin was approximately 9 years old. His clan abandoned the family, leaving them to near starvation. He would build the largest contiguous land empire in history and then vanish. His burial site remains lost to this day, protected by a zone where entry was punishable by death for centuries. Through strategic alliances, betrayals, and relentless warfare, Temujin unified the Mongol tribes. At a Kurultai, or assembly, in 1206 at the Onon River's source, he was proclaimed Genghis Khan, meaning universal ruler or Khan of all between the oceans. He revolutionized warfare through decimal organization, with units of 10, 100, and 1,000, merit-based promotion over hereditary privilege, psychological warfare that preceded each campaign, and a policy of either complete submission or utter annihilation. Cities that surrendered peacefully were generally spared and incorporated into the empire. Cities that resisted faced total destruction as a warning to others. The Mongol conquests killed an estimated number ranging widely. Some reconstructions suggest tens of millions, roughly 10 to 11% of the world's population at the time. This matches World War II's death toll, but from a population base of only 400 million. No conqueror in history killed a larger percentage of humanity. The campaign against the Khwarezmian Empire from 1219 to 1221 may have killed 10 to 15 million people alone. Persian historian Rashid al-Din claims 1.3 million were killed at the city of Merv and 1.7 million at Nishapur. Modern scholars consider these numbers exaggerated, but they indicate unprecedented slaughter. The Western Xia, or Tangut Kingdom, was destroyed so completely that historian John Mann describes it as possibly the first recorded example of attempted genocide and very successful ethnocide. The Tanguts were so thoroughly annihilated that little knowledge of their civilization survives. At its maximum extent, the Mongol Empire covered 22% of Earth's surface, 12.5 million square miles, making it the largest contiguous land empire in history. It stretched from the Pacific Ocean to Eastern Europe. At Bukhara, Genghis declared to survivors, "If you hadn't committed great sins, God would not have inflicted a punishment like me upon you." He adopted the title Flail of God, presenting his conquests as divine punishment. This combination of military superiority and psychological warfare made resistance seem futile. Specific units were assigned quotas of victims. Captives were marched ahead of Mongol armies as human shields during sieges. Propaganda about Mongol ferocity was deliberately spread, ensuring that rumors of what happened to resistant cities reached the next target before the Mongol army arrived. Genghis Khan died in August 1227 during the Western Shah campaign. The exact cause is unknown. His burial site remains unknown to this day. According to legend, soldiers killed everyone they encountered during the funeral procession. 1,000 to 2,000 horses trampled the gravesite to erase evidence of its location. Slaves who dug the tomb were executed, and their executioners were then killed to ensure secrecy. A 240 square kilometer Great Taboo Zone around Burkan Khaldun Mountain was declared forbidden, with entry punishable by death. This prohibition was enforced for centuries. The empire fragmented among Genghis Khan's descendants by the 1260s and eventually collapsed entirely by the 1700s. But the genetic legacy endures. Studies suggest approximately 1 in 200 men alive today may be Genghis Khan's descendants. The strangest irony of Genghis Khan's conquests is environmental. One study estimates the massive killing spree removed approximately 700 million tons of carbon from the atmosphere as depopulated farmland reverted to forest. The man who killed 10% of humanity inadvertently helped the planet recover from human agriculture. Then came medieval Russia's most infamous ruler. Ivan IV, known as Ivan the Terrible, was born on August 25, 1530. He lost his father at age 3 and his mother at age 8. His childhood was dominated by competing boyar factions who ignored and abused him. This upbringing bred lifelong paranoia and cruelty toward the nobility. In a fit of rage, he would kill his own capable heir, guaranteeing the extinction of a dynasty that had ruled for over 700 years and plunging Russia into chaos. On January 16, 1547, at age 16, Ivan became the first ruler crowned Tsar of all Russia, a title derived from Caesar that claimed equality with Roman emperors. His early reign saw genuine reforms. The first national assembly called the Zemsky Sobor, a revised legal code, and the creation of Russia's first standing army. He conquered the Kazan Khanate in 1552 and the Astrakhan Khanate in 1556, giving Russia control of the entire Volga River. But personal tragedy, particularly the death of his beloved first wife Anastasia in 1560, triggered his descent into paranoid tyranny. In December 1564, Ivan announced his intention to abdicate. He withdrew to Alexandrovsk with the treasury and sent 2 letters, one attacking the nobility and clergy, one reassuring common people. The terrified boyar council agreed to his demands: creation of a personal territory called the Oprichnina, and unlimited power to deal with traitors. The Oprichnina period from 1565 to 1572 saw Ivan create a private army of 1,000 to 6,000 black-robed fanatics who rode with severed dogs' heads on their saddles, symbolizing their mission to sniff out traitors. 1/3 to 1/2 of Muscovy became Ivan's personal domain, policed by his death squads. Methods of execution included impalement, boiling alive, roasting over open fires, and dismemberment by horses. The Novgorod massacre from January to February 1570 lasted 5 weeks. Ivan suspected the city of treason and disloyalty. Victims were tied to sleighs and run into the freezing Volkhov River. 500 to 600 people were killed daily. Modern estimates suggest between 2,000 and 15,000 deaths. 90% of surrounding farmland was destroyed. Novgorod never regained its former prominence as one of Russia's greatest cities. Even Metropolitan Philip, the highest Orthodox Church official, who publicly condemned the Oprichnina from the pulpit, was strangled in his cell by Ivan's chief enforcer, Malyuta Skuratov, in December 1569. Killing the church's highest authority demonstrated that no one was safe from Ivan's paranoia. On November 19, 1581, Ivan beat his pregnant daughter-in-law for wearing what he considered immodest clothing. She miscarried. When his son Ivan Ivanovich confronted him about this attack, the Tsar struck him in the head with his iron-tipped staff. The heir died days later from the wound. Ivan died on March 28, 1584, apparently of a stroke while preparing to play chess. The throne passed to his middle son, Fyodor I, described as weak-minded and dim-witted. When Fyodor died childless in 1598, the Rurik dynasty, which had ruled for over 700 years, ended. The resulting time of troubles from 1598 to 1613 saw famine kill 1/3 of the population, multiple pretenders claim the throne, and Polish-Lithuanian forces occupy Moscow. By killing his capable heir in a fit of rage, Ivan guaranteed the extinction of his dynasty and the near destruction of the state he had expanded. The Terrible earned his name not just for what he did to his enemies, but for what he did to Russia itself. And finally, medieval Wallachnia's most iconic torturer. Vlad III, known as Vlad the Impaler, was born around 1428 as the son of Vlad II Dracul. The name Dracul means dragon, from his father's membership in the Order of the Dragon. Young Vlad and his brother Radu were held as Ottoman hostages from ages 11 to 17 to ensure their father's loyalty to the Ottoman Empire. Radu adapted to captivity and even converted to Islam. Vlad grew to hate the Ottomans with a fury that would define his reign. In 1447, rival boyars murdered Vlad's father and tortured, blinded, and buried his elder brother alive. Vlad spent years in exile before seizing the Wallachian throne with Hungarian support in 1456. Contemporary chronicles claim he impaled between 40,000 and 100,000 victims during his reign. Numbers are heavily disputed. Contemporaries exaggerated for propaganda purposes. Saxon merchants wanted to discredit him commercially, and Ottoman enemies sought to delegitimize him politically. The actual scale was likely far lower than legendary accounts, but the terror was real. Vlad's preferred method of execution was impalement. Victims were placed on sharpened stakes, often rounded to prevent quick death. The stake was inserted through a bodily orifice and emerged through the upper body or mouth. Stakes, sometimes 17 feet tall, were erected vertically, and victims slid down slowly over hours or days. In June 1462, Vlad created what became known as the Forest of the Impaled outside Targoviste. He allegedly impaled approximately 20,000 men, women, and children across an area 3 miles long and 1 mile wide. Ottoman commander Hamza Pasha was placed on the tallest stake after having his arms and legs cut off first. Sultan Mehmed II reportedly was dumbstruck and horrified. Some accounts claim he retreated rather than face Vlad in battle after witnessing this display. When Turkish ambassadors refused to remove their turbans in his presence, citing religious custom, Vlad had the turbans nailed to their heads. Vlad lost his throne multiple times. After the 1462 Ottoman invasion, he was imprisoned by his Hungarian allies for 12 years. His final reign lasted approximately 1 month before he was killed in battle near Bucharest in December 1476 or January 1477. His head was cut off and sent to Sultan Mehmed II in Constantinople, preserved in honey, then displayed on a stake, an ironic end for the impaler. The traditional burial site is Znagov Monastery, but a 1933 excavation found no body, only animal bones. Bram Stoker borrowed the name for his 1897 novel Dracula, though the connection to the historical Vlad is debated. In Romania today, Vlad is considered one of the most important national rulers, a defender of independence against Ottoman expansion. Defense ministers have acknowledged he would have been condemned for crimes against humanity at Nuremberg, yet he remains a national hero. The impaler was himself impaled after death, and the brutal ruler who killed to prevent Ottoman conquest ultimately failed as his brother, Radu, became an Ottoman puppet ruler. Looking across these 10 rulers spanning 7 centuries and 4 continents, certain patterns emerge. Nearly all exploited chaos to gain power. Stalin maneuvered through Lenin's succession. Mao rode the Japanese invasion. Pol Pot rose from American bombing chaos. They built cults of personality that exceeded rational loyalty while accumulating massive wealth as their populations suffered. The pattern holds. Absolute power creates absolute hypocrisy. Their methods shared common elements. Terror was systematic, not random. Stalin's Great Purge had quotas. Pol Pot's tool sling processed prisoners bureaucratically. The cruelty was organized, rationalized, routine. How they fell reveals 3 patterns. Military defeat like Tojo and Amin, natural death in power like Stalin and Mao, or battlefield death like Vlad and Genghis. Only one faced justice. Tojo was tried and hanged, though even his ashes were later enshrined at Yasukuni. What they lost varies. Stalin's terror created guards too terrified to save him. Ivan's rage killed the heir who would have preserved his dynasty. Mao's policies devastated the nation he sought to strengthen. The drive for absolute power consistently undermines itself. But what remains? Mao's portrait still hangs over Tiananmen. Kim's grandson rules North Korea. Genghis Khan's tomb is UNESCO heritage. The monsters die, but their shadows persist, often because millions chose compliance over courage. Stalin started as a seminary student and ended dying alone on a floor. Mao started as a library assistant and ended with his wife calling herself his dog. Pol Pot started as a failed student and ended cremated on garbage. None of them got what they wanted in the end. Power killed millions, but killing eventually killed power. If you've watched this far, you know the warning signs. You know the patterns. You know how easily ordinary people become participants in evil. The question is, what you'll do with that knowledge. Because the 10 rulers in this documentary needed millions of people to choose compliance over courage, to follow orders instead of conscience, to look away instead of speaking up. History doesn't repeat itself exactly, but it rhymes. And when you hear the rhyme starting again, you'll recognize it. The consolidation of power, the elimination of rivals, the creation of enemies, the demands for absolute loyalty, the promises of paradise through submission. You'll recognize it. The question is what you do then.